delighted to be joined by Lindsay Skinner. Lindsay is currently head teacher at St James School, Exeter, which is also the school she went to as a child. She was first published after writing a piece that she was passionate about and sending it into various papers where it was picked up by The Guardian. Lindsay writes resource books for English teachers and is also working on 2 new books. A resource book aimed at primary teachers on crafting brilliant sentences, and a book detailing experiences from her working life. Welcome, Lindsay. Great to have you on the call.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Just to frame the questions, we'll be starting with 6 opening questions, more general questions about becoming an author. Then we'll move on to your top 3 tips, and then to finish off, we have a question submitted by the ISN member of the ISN community. So my first opening question, Lindsay, why should educators think about writing or becoming an author?
I think, like, firstly, who knows an English teacher who doesn't secretly want to be a writer? I think, like, most people have this sort of quiet sense that they want to write something. So firstly, I think people should do it because they enjoy it and they want to. But I do also think that there's something about giving back to the teaching community and the educating community, because like resourcing takes a really long time, and when you've got a really quality resource or some great ideas, the idea that through writing we can expand that network and mean that many people in England, but internationally too, are able to then share those ideas and use those ideas in their classroom, and the impact that can then have, I think, is a really positive thing. And I think writing is a lovely way to do that, because you know, you can share ideas and on Twitter and through blogs, and all of that I think is brilliant as well. But through writing, it becomes a process where you've also got an editor and you've also got other creatives adding ideas in and refining the ideas, and so the level of quality that you get and the reach that you get really grows. And so yeah, I think it's a really brilliant thing. I would recommend it for anyone.
And how is that journey? How easy is it to sort of get published?
I think it's probably different for different people. So for me, I'd wanted to be a writer from when I was like a tiny child, and was always like writing little books and, you know, all of those kind of things as a child, and but I just never had been. And then I'd ended up being a teacher, and it just didn't really feel like I ever had the time to do anything other than be a teacher or recover in the holidays when I was also doing loads of marking. So I think it can feel quite difficult, but I was fortunate because I was working for Pixel, and they were doing presentations across the country. And actually, in this particular instance, I was doing one in Wales, and there was another speaker, Julia, and Julia happened to just get chatting with me at a table, and we ended up spending the day together. And she, at the very end of our conversation of spending the day together, mentioned that she wrote for HarperCollins. And I said, oh, wow, that's my dream. She said, oh, I'll put you in touch. And so I then ended up having a conversation with an editor. So for me, it ended up being that I kind of got in just because I met somebody. But I do think it is really possible now, particularly with Twitter and LinkedIn, to find the person that you want to pitch your book to. And as long as you've got clarity of idea, contact them with a brief overview. And if they're interested, they will get in touch, because one thing that I always kind of had thought about publishing was that it was kind of a reserved club for people, and you had to know particular people to get in. But I think I've learned is that they're always just looking for the best ideas and for exciting ideas, and they're up for publishing anything that they think will do really well and excite people. So I think find who you want to pitch to, and whether that's through someone you know or through Twitter or through LinkedIn, and then when you've done that, have absolute clarity about your pitch and approach people, and don't be frightened to approach people, because I think the journey into publishing is easier than people fear it is, and so it's definitely worth doing.
Brilliant. And how should potential authors figure out or start to think about who their audience is?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think it probably depends if they're, you know, if authors are writing fiction or if they're writing non-fiction. And I mean, in the educational publishing that I've been doing, largely the audience has been teachers, right? So, but not every teacher uses a resource like this. And so, so for me, it was about thinking, okay, well, what are the key problems that people face in the classroom, and then can my book be a solution to that? And so with Crafting Brilliant Sentences, which is the one I feel like, it was the first one I pitched, but the one I filmed, but not the first one I published actually, but it was the first one I pitched. It's the one I feel most excited about, because I feel like a lot of English teachers had this thing with kids where they would write a paragraph of what they thought was one sentence, and there would be a capital letter at the start of the paragraph and a full stop at the end, and then a series of horrible comma splices all the way throughout. And I hated that as a practitioner when I was younger. And I remember emailing Debbie Myhill, who taught me to teach and who is a terrific grammarian, but also researcher. And I said, like, Debbie, how do you get kids to write in sentences? She was like, well, if you ever figure that out, you're going to make loads of money. I was like, oh, right, okay, I haven't yet, but you know, we'll wait. And so it was clearly a problem for me. And then when you contact someone like Debbie, she was like, it's a complex answer. So it became apparent to me that there was like not a hole in the market, but like an area that needed support. Behavior is another one. There's loads of areas, I think, you know, the gap with disadvantage, where we see in education that there's a clear gap. And I think considering where your gap might be and how your writing can fill that gap, that tells you who your audience is, because then your audience is everyone who's got that problem, which is a large one. It's only really when you've got a more niche idea that your audience is much narrower. And so really, yeah, for me, it's just, I think, identifying a really key area in education that needs an input, and then your audience is everyone in education, rather than just being quite a narrow one.
And once you sort of narrow down your audience, how should potential authors ensure they are considering non-native English speakers when writing too?
Yeah, and I think this one is a difficult one. I think one thing that, you know, you could talk about clarity of sentences and structure and all of that kind of stuff. And I do think that's important, particularly in order to write clearly, particularly for non-native speakers, although perhaps maybe not for Germans, because the verb comes so late often in their language. But having the main clause as close to the front of the sentence as possible, I think, can really help add clarity. But actually, I think that one of the things that is helpful with engaging a more international audience is actually just being aware of your potential lack of diversity in the text and in the examples that you choose, because I think it's really easy to just see from the perspective that you are from, right? And so you know, I've been working on some books with Collins, the Who We Are series, where we've tried to include a range of texts so that every child feels seen, and you know, we've included authors from across the diasporas, and I think that to me is an exciting way to engage an international audience, so that the texts that you use and the examples that you use are so wide ranging that people feel that it sees them and it engages with them and their life. So one, yeah, clarity in terms of writing, and I think that can be done quite easily by moving the main clause. But for me, it's more about the emotional engagement and the ability to use these in their own scenario.
And before you begin the writing process, do you have a clear idea about the purpose of your piece?
Yeah, so for me, I'm not the kind of person who would be able to find myself any level of motivation if I didn't have absolute clarity about what the point is. So so when I had my first meeting with my editor Kathy, when I'd been introduced by Julia, I literally went with like a full-blown pitch, and it was just because I think, yeah, for me, it's about finding a problem and how you can solve it if you're creating resources. And so I begin with planning out. It's on paper actually for me, not on a computer, which is probably a bit old school, but I plan everything out on big A3 bits of paper, like what the point is, how it might be structured, and who the audience is, and then go to the editor with that pitch. And then that allows me to kind of make sure that I can structure things well, I think. Yeah, so that's for me. I mean, I don't really know how you could write without a clear sense of kind of where you're going. It's a very kind of old school English teacher thing to say, isn't it? Like, you must know your audience, you must know your purpose, you must know your form. But I do think that that's a good place to start, because otherwise I think it's quite easy to run out of steam, or for your piece to just be quite meandering.
And I suppose, is there a danger that if you try and figure out the purpose as you go, you could sort of get lost in the content, and that can be quite a dangerous path to go down, perhaps? Or would you say that is a potential other avenue that will form as you write it?
I think so in fiction, I totally get the whole Alice Walker, let the characters come to you and just see how it evolves. And totally, when I write fiction, I find that characters surprise me, and I'm like, oh, you're going to do that, are you? Like, which is almost I'm aware that makes me almost bonkers. Definitely with fiction, it finding its own narrative and evolving in a way that might surprise you, I totally get. I find that less with when you're writing text to support teachers. The whole point is that they need a structure to support them in their lessons, and something that they can dip into either parts of or take as a whole. And so if you don't have clarity right from the off, there's a real potential that it will lack clarity as an overall piece. And that might come out in the editing process, but the editing process potentially can be painful. So I'll just avoid that by having clarity in the first place.
Excellent. And what exciting opportunities does being an author offer?
Oh, it's just lovely, isn't it? Like, firstly, having your own book actually printed feels, I can't even describe it. It feels glorious. It is such a lovely thing. You get it in the post, and I don't know why 7, but I got 7 when I very first was published, and they sent them in the post, and then you open them up and it's like, oh, my name is on the front of a book. I don't even know why that feels so lovely, but it really does. But actually, in terms of opportunities, it's things like this, and people knowing you for particular strands of work. So people associate me with crafting sentences and that kind of work, which is nice. But more importantly than anything, around like how I feel about it, what I love is, particularly with something like Crafting Brilliant Sentences, is that like 1/3 of secondary schools own that book, and that means that kids are learning to write in sentences across the country, and like the impact that I've been able to have by writing on people's pedagogy and on the learning in classrooms, like across the country, that to me is an opportunity. It's like, it's not just the opportunities that it's given me, but if those kids can write accurately, the opportunities it's given to them is quite exciting to me. And I feel that like with educational writing, because what's nice about educational writing is that you are usually writing for teachers and or leaders or both, and if you impact just one of those people, the sphere of influence that each one of those has is enormous, right? Because they work in schools, they work with hundreds of people every day. So for me, that's the opportunity. There's something really beautiful about being able to create some kind of legacy by impacting teachers who then impact their communities, a community that you might never have even been to. And I think that's a really nice way into that through writing.
Wonderful. And now moving on to your first top tip, Lindsay. What's your first tip for writers?
I mean, right. So it won't surprise you that my first tip for writing, number 1, is that you should structure your texts really clearly, so that they are designed as functional, well-structured resources. And the reason I say that won't surprise you is because I love structure. I love sentence structures, and I love structure as a whole. But I think it's really, really important that people work before they do any kind of big writing and structure their piece. But I also think that can help. 1, it creates clarity and it stops you kind of meandering off. 2, it can really help to hold you to account, because essentially, if you've got a clear structure, you've then got a checklist. And the thing is about being a teacher and also a writer is like finding the time to write is actually, I think, quite hard and quite a challenge. So like I tend to binge write, and so it's the summer, and I suddenly set myself a task of writing this amount of said book. So having a really clear structure where each of the component parts, whether it be chapters or sections or whatever, and then, you know, whether it's lesson resources or whatever might fall underneath that, having that structured out really well, or on a smaller piece like an article, having bullet pointed in each kind of large paragraph or section that you're going to talk about is helpful, because then after that, what you're able to do is just drop in and out, and you can even write it out of order. So when I was writing Crafting Brilliant Sentences, there were times like over the summer when honestly I couldn't really be bothered to do some writing, and I would rather have gone out and gone to the coast or whatever, but you know, I had a deadline, so I needed to write this book. So, but because I had the structure, I was able to jump in and write something that I found easier, or that was more interesting. Like I love a semicolon, so I'd like go in and sit and write the semicolon sections. And I really like writing the noun. I found that writing the noun sections of the book really easy. So I sort of jumped in and read the easier sections. And then when I was more focused and maybe more motivated, I was able to write some of the other stuff. But because I had the structure, that was what allowed me to do that and continue writing. Whereas if you haven't got that structure really laid out, that's harder to do. And I also think it's just having the structure laid out and ticking them off is really satisfying. You know, it's like the typical teacher to-do list thing. Just ticking them off is actually really satisfying. I would recommend any kind of structure like that, doing it on paper or OneNote, so you can do the tick list, because it that really helps keep the kind of motivation high. So it creates clarity and it also creates motivation, I think, are the kind of two things I would say about having a clear structure.
And just a question off that, really. So you create your structure on paper first, and then at what point do you then transfer that and work solely on the computer so that it's easier to sort of manage that, I suppose?
Yeah. So at the writing process, so I do really like to write on paper, but it is totally impractical, which I am aware of. So and I try to write by hand on OneNote with the pen, because it can convert your handwriting into typing, but apparently not my handwriting, so who knew. So like when we go to like Hay Festival and stuff like that, and I quite often will take a book to write there and then type it up afterwards. But actually, for me, any kind of work that I'm doing properly for a publisher, all of the structure I do all on paper, and then the minute it gets to actually writing, it goes straight onto computer. And that's actually because often I'm then sending it repeatedly to the editor to get feedback anyway. So yeah, I pretty much always write directly onto the computer.
Brilliant. And your second top tip, Lindsay?
Okay, so my second top tip is that think about your syntax and craft sentences that are beautiful. I think that syntax really matters, and the rhythm of a sentence and the way the parts of the sentence are put together really can help to engage a reader and create a beautiful flow and fluidity to your writing. I think it's worth playing with sentence structures. So if you're writing a sentence in your piece, and this definitely applies in fiction and I think somewhat in non-fiction too, taking a sentence structure and moving the component parts. And there's an example I quite often use when I'm talking to people about writing, and that is in the dead of night, just out of sight, a man was waiting. And I project it up on the board, but then I project it up in several different ways. So it's a man was waiting just out of sight in the dead of night, or in the dead of night, a man was waiting just outside. All the different components, the ways that you could put that together. And then I asked the audience, like, okay, so which is the most effective? And what's interesting about that is that I don't say what effect I'm trying to create, right? I just say what's most effective. And so they kind of opt for the one that they like the best and that creates the effect, presumably, that they find the most satisfying. But as a writer, you have already decided what the effect is. So for me, like if you're trying to create suspense, just in the dead of night, a man was waiting, dash, just out of sight. That for me creates a kind of level of, oh, he's out of sight and that's bad. And that bit coming last is quite like, but equally it could be in any order. I feel like as writers, we need to deliberately play with that. It's like, don't be a writer if you don't love sentences. Don't be a baker if you don't like the smell of bread. Like, playing with sentences for me is really the crux of where like beautiful writing comes, I think.
And how might you find your voice and sort of craft a beautiful sentence? Is there a sort of journey you would go through to sort of figure out how that might be done?
Yeah, definitely reading about sentences. So there's a glorious book, how to write a sentence and how to read one, is a really nice book, is a way in to thinking about how sentences might be structured. And in fact, actually, there's in the opening of that, it talks about a sentence like discovering, I first heard about the package on the way up the stairs, or something like that. And then it talks about how rhythmically you might make that one. But what he does in that is he talks about how many questions that sentence creates, because it's like, so you were on the way up, like, one, who are you? But you're on the way up the stairs. Is there a reason you're going up the stairs? You heard about the package. Who did you hear about it from? And what's the package? Because the package is presumably important in some kind of way. And I think that, so it just explores that, and about how do you create those kind of hooks, and gets you thinking about, one, how do you create hooks in sentences, and two, how do you structure sentences so that they do that well. And then reading fiction, I think, is probably the best place. Much as I feel uncomfortable with the content of the book, Lolita, the opening paragraph of Lolita, when he talks about the trip of the tip of the tongue on 3, Lolita, that rhythmically is a really beautiful piece. And then the other thing, I think, if you really want to feel the rhythm and find the rhythms that you like, reading poetry is the obvious way in, because you'll see lots of lovely rhythms that then can be moved into prose. And I think that you find it yourself. If you read aloud your work, and so you write a sentence, read it aloud, think about how it feels in the mouth, that you find whether it's nice or not, and then you're like, oh, this feels a bit awkward. So it's really common for me to do some writing on my own and then read it aloud to my partner afterwards, and then be like, oh no, hang on a minute, just stop for a second, and then I have to rephrase the sentence, and then go again, and then like, oh no, hang on a minute, until the rhythm feels perfect. So I think the reading aloud bit really helps.
Brilliant. And then that sort of nicely moves on to your final top tip.
Yeah, so my third tip is that you need to get feedback. It's really important, I think, to get feedback. One, obviously, like, that helps you get better. If you've got a range of people that you can send your work to and ask for candid feedback, I really think that does help you get better at writing. But I also think it's important for confidence. So, like, everyone's kind of got a bit of an imposter syndrome when it comes to writing, because everyone wants to write something, and then they don't all necessarily get to do that or feel that they can do that. And so having somebody say, oh no, that's actually useful, or laugh at your writing, or whatever it might be, is I think a really important thing to do. And hopefully, like, people will have those people around them, and if they don't have them in their personal life, I think that there's quite a good professional network, your network, where they can share their work and seek feedback. And if they're not quite at the stage where they're ready to do that, I think writing, leaving it for 3 days and coming back to it to try to come at it critically, if you still think it's good after that point, share it and ask for feedback, because I think, one, that makes you better, but two, it will give you the confidence to write. And like, you've just got to put yourself out there. But so, like, when I first wrote my first article, I'd never written an article before other than in the classroom, and I just I'd been out for dinner, and there were several other couples, and some people had come into the bar that we were in, and then one of the couples just dropped hands and didn't want to be near each other anymore. I was like, what? Like, are you okay? Has there been an argument? Like, what's happening? They were like, oh, there are some parents over there and we're not out. They were a gay couple. And I was like, oh, right. And it made me feel really cross, because it was like 2015. I was like, guys, how is it that it's 2015 and your Saturday night is so impinged because you're frightened. So I went home and wrote an article about it in a mood, because that's a good cathartic thing for me to do. And I read it and I thought, this is funny and I think important. I feel like people should read it. So I literally just thought, well, I'm going to do it. I'm just going to send it off to people. So I sent it to the TES and I sent it to the Independent. I sent it to the Guardian. And much to my surprise, the next day, the Guardian had contacted and said, yeah, we're going to publish this. Like, wow, okay, that's good. So like seeking feedback and putting yourself out there, I think really is worth doing. And it ended up being the most read of 2015. Like it was clearly the time for that article. Lots of people were like, actually, yeah, that things do need to change here. So I think seeking feedback and publishing your stuff, putting your stuff out there, it's worth it because that's the only way you're going to get anywhere, right?
And Lindsay, just another question on that. Would you say the benefits of from getting feedback from loved ones and then from people that that you don't know, and then could potentially rule out any potential bias, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's, right, if you ask your mum, she's probably going to tell you it's great regardless, and I totally get that. Although I actually think that it is braver getting kind of feedback from loved ones because they're the people, well, you love them, right? And so you want them to think that you're good, and also you see them so frequently. I think that there's a real safety in seeking feedback from strangers, and I also think that's probably the most productive, but it needs to be done somewhere safe. And I think like your platform is a great example of that, where you can put your work out into the world and seek feedback in a way that is going to be constructive and critical, like totally, because that's the point. But it's from people who aren't biased, who know more probably about the subject area, and who can really boost your confidence. Because if people have got no skin in the game, think that what you're doing is great, then for me that just seems like a good motivator to move forward. So I think totally to get it from your family and friends too, but I think that's a different thing. That's like more of an emotional thing, whereas something like your platform is really about refining your practice.
Brilliant, wonderful. And now our final question is been submitted by an ISN member, and the question is, how do you create teaching resources that can be adapted to fit different learning needs?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one because there's always this debate about how do you change resources to adapt people. So I think that I'm a believer in teaching to the top. So really having decided ideally what everyone would be able to master in your classroom, and then I think the job of the teacher is to facilitate it so that everyone can get there. So what I do usually is structure the resource so that it simply teaches what I would want it to teach, without thinking, right, and how do I accommodate the learning needs? And then after, go back to the lesson and say, right, where are the sticking points going to be? Where is it that someone might find it difficult? So, if they had this kind of need, what might they be struggling with? Or this kind of need, what might they be struggling with? And then I go in and create either additional layers of commentary for the teacher of, so these might be the misconceptions, here's what to do about them, which I quite often do in brackets in the lesson plan. Or if a child is struggling with this, and I did it with crafting brilliant sentences, if a child is struggling with this particular thing, here's the intervention resource that can go with it that you might do. But then, as well as focusing on the intervention resources and the misconceptions, I try to thread through my lesson plans commentary for teachers where it says things like, set off this task and then go to the group of learners who, or go here and do some guided reading, or you might want to set up your classroom in a way that allows you to, use mini whiteboards so that you can see immediately who does and doesn't get it. And then if there are children who are struggling, you can do ABC with them. So I think starting with the end in mind and having real clarity about wanting everyone to get there, because I think that that's an important part of equity. And then everything is about how do you scaffold the learners who have got additional needs to get there as well. And I write that in generally afterwards. The editors are quite good at helping with that because they say, this seems quite hard. which is code for you need to put some scaffolding steps in here, Linz. And I think that the other thing I would say is that resources can't do everything, and that teachers know their kids the best. And though you've got kind of some kind of generic overviews of learning needs, every individual learner is different. And so I think teachers taking those resources and helping put scaffolding in themselves when they know their children is obviously totally vital.
Wonderful, and thank you so much, Lindsay. That's brilliant. That brings us to the end of the conversation. And yeah, just sort of one more question, I suppose. Do you have any sort of upcoming books that you have in mind that you're currently writing, or anything that you might like to tell the audience about that you've got upcoming?
Yeah, so a few bits. So I'm currently doing the big plans for a potential primary crafting brilliant sentences, which is exciting for me. I really feel like, you know, if we can utilize the grammar knowledge that they get in primary and change that knowledge into a really functional and clever use of crafting sentences, that would be brilliant. And you know, this time, for the first time ever, actually, writing was the lowest performing part of the SATs, and I think that that's largely off the back of the pandemic. I think it was quite difficult to teach writing online, and I think that there's probably some work that needs to go into remedying some of the gaps that the kids might have. But I love the idea of primary children coming up to our secondaries with an ability to not just have that grammar knowledge of being able to label things, but understanding why, if you move something here, the effect that might create, and then being able to play with that, and that sense of play, rather than it just being grammar and them feeling like that's a bit boring. So yeah, I'm excited about that, but that's just in the planning stages. And then I'm also quite heavily into a piece that is kind of documenting the life of a teacher, and it's a memoir is too grand a word, but it's more of a silly kind of diary style piece that is, I think, both funny and at some points quite sad, but as it always is in the life of a teacher. So I just recently had a couple of days where my wife went away, and that allowed me to properly write, and I wrote just over 14,000 words in 2 days. This is like really a lot of writing, and I feel excited about that piece too. But I'm hoping that will be near enough finished by the end of the summer. So then we'll see where that goes. Yeah.
Brilliant. Some very exciting stuff in the pipeline then, it sounds like. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much again for your time, Lindsay. Yeah, some great top tips there that I know our audience will find super valuable. So yeah, thank you once again for your time.
Thanks.